In the 1920s, the rich didn't get bored like normal people. They got dangerously bored. When money stopped being exciting, they started using people, animals, science, and even pain as entertainment. This video isn't about luxury. It's about what happens when wealth has nothing left to conquer. These are 44 real things rich people did just to kill time. 1. The prize for the absolute worst drink menu in history goes to Earl Carroll and his bathtub party because apparently glass bottles were too complicated for rich people. This Broadway producer decided the best way to serve expensive champagne was to fill a bathtub with it and have a model sit in the middle of the punch bowl. Then, the most dignified men in New York actually lined up with cups to scoop the drink right out of the tub she was sitting in. It was a hygiene nightmare masquerading as high society fun, and the federal government was not amused. They eventually indicted Carroll for perjury, proving that drinking lukewarm champagne out of a used bathtub is not just gross, it is a federal crime. 2. Nothing proves that money cannot buy dignity quite like the trend of wealthy businessmen throwing infant parties to escape their stress. You had railroad tycoons and bankers, men who controlled the entire economy, squeezing themselves into oversized romper suits to crawl around a ballroom floor. They would drink gin out of milk bottles and play with wooden rattles, while a jazz band awkwardly played in the corner trying not to lose it. The idea was to psychologically return to a time of innocence, but seeing a 40-year-old titan of industry throwing a tantrum in a lace bib isn't cute. It just looks like a collective nervous breakdown with a very high budget. 3. The wealthy men of the 1920s were terrified of getting old, but instead of buying a sports car, they spent their fortunes on the monkey gland treatment. This is not a metaphor. Thousands of rich guys paid a surgeon named Dr. Voronov to surgically graft testicle tissue from chimpanzees and baboons into their own bodies because they thought it would give them eternal youth. It was the ultimate snake oil scam for the ultra-rich, who were walking around high society parties convinced they had the energy of a primate. It is hard to keep a straight face when you realize the most powerful bankers and politicians of the decade were making business deals while secretly harboring monkey parts in their trousers. 4. You think your gym supplement routine is intense? It is absolutely nothing compared to the wealthy playboy Eben Byers, who decided the best way to cure his boredom was to drink literal radioactive waste. In the 1920s, Radioactive was sold as a miracle energy drink for the rich, and Byers loved the stuff so much he chugged over 1,000 bottles of it. He went around bragging about his glowing health right up until his bones literally began to disintegrate and his body fell apart. It is the ultimate example of having more money than brain cells, paying a premium price to slowly dissolve your own skeleton just because a shiny label promised you some extra pep on the golf course. 5. Marchesa. Luisa Casati was basically the original influencer but with way more money and absolutely zero impulse control when it came to shopping for pets. She got bored of normal dogs and decided to walk a pair of live cheetahs on diamond leashes through the city streets while wearing nothing but a fur coat. But her dinner parties were the real circus because she would sit life-sized wax mannequins at the table right next to real people. Imagine trying to make small talk with the guy next to you for 20 minutes before realizing he is made of candle wax and wearing a wig. She treated the world like her personal dollhouse, and honestly, if you are rich enough to turn a deadly predator into a fashion accessory, nobody is going to tell you that your dinner guests are melting. 6. The bright young things of London turned petty theft into a competitive sport because buying things is apparently too easy when you have daddy's credit card. These bored aristocrats organized massive scavenger hunts across the city, but the list did not include hidden Easter eggs. They were racing their luxury cars to steal actual policeman helmets, swipe morning newspapers from doorsteps, and essentially harass the working class for points. It is the kind of logic where Grand Theft Auto is just a fun board game because you know the judge goes to the same country club as your father. They were tearing up London and annoying the entire police force just to win a plastic trophy and bragging rights at brunch the next morning. 7. The definition of tone-deaf reached new heights with the poverty balls, where the super-rich pretended to be poor because they thought starvation was a cute aesthetic. While regular people were struggling to buy bread, socialites spent thousands of dollars decorating ballrooms to look like dirty coal mines or hobo camps. They wore costumes made of silk that were cut to look like rags and drank their expensive champagne out of old tin cans just to feel gritty. It is the ultimate level of boredom where you cosplay as a destitute person for 3 hours, take some photos, and then have your chauffeur drive you home to your mansion. They literally turned economic struggle into a theme party because regular masquerade balls were just not offensive enough. 8. You might think playing polo with horses is already a sport for people with too much money. But in the 1920s, the wealthy decided that horses were simply not dangerous enough. Enter the sport of auto polo, where bored rich folks stripped down expensive Model T cars, removed the roofs and doors, and drove them around a field smashing into each other while swinging giant wooden mallets. It was essentially a demolition derby, but played by people in tuxedos who thought whiplash was a fun weekend activity. The cars would frequently flip over, catch fire, or lose wheels, and the drivers would just hop out, grab a fresh car from their fleet, and keep playing. It takes a special kind of boredom to look at a luxury automobile and think, I bet I could hit a ball with this if I drive fast enough into a wall. 9. If you were a wealthy hotel owner in the Jazz Age, the trendiest lawn ornament you could buy was not a statue, but a living human being sitting on top of a giant stick. This was the golden age of flagpole sitting, and the rich funded this absolute madness just to have something to look at while they drank their morning coffee. The most famous sitter, Shipwreck Kelly, would be hired by wealthy patrons to sit on a tiny platform hundreds of feet in the air for weeks at a time, surviving on liquids hoisted up by a rope. Crowds of high society folks would gather below, craning their necks and betting money on when he would fall off, which is honestly the most expensive and boring version of reality television ever invented. 10. William Randolph. Hearst was basically the final boss of spending money on things nobody needs, and his boredom led to him treating historical European architecture like a set of Lego bricks. He decided he wanted a Spanish monastery for his California estate, but he did not just want a replica. He bought an actual ancient monastery in Spain, had workers dismantle it stone by stone, packed it into thousands of crates, and shipped it across the ocean. The absurdity is that once the crates arrived, his eccentric hoarding habits kicked in, and he just left many of them sitting in a warehouse because he got bored with the project. Imagine buying a literal castle, shipping it halfway around the world, and then forgetting to unbox it because you found a shiny new zebra for your private zoo instead. 11. While the poor were dancing in marathons to win prize money, the wealthy treated these exhaustion contests like a personal zoo exhibit. Rich socialites would buy expensive box seats at these grueling events, showing up in diamonds and furs to watch couples drag themselves around the floor for hundreds of hours. They would sit there eating roasted chicken and drinking illegal champagne right in front of the exhausted dancers, treating the contestants like racehorses. Some wealthy patrons even hired specific couples to race for them, cheering from the sidelines like they were at a track, proving that extreme boredom can completely turn off your empathy switch. 12. When the richest men in the world, Henry Ford, Thomas Edison, and Harvey Firestone, decided to go camping, they did not exactly sleep in sleeping bags and eat beans from a can. They called themselves the Vagabonds, which is hilarious because their version of roughing it involved a 50-car convoy, a personal chef, refrigerated trucks for their steaks, and a full staff of servants to chop the wood. They would pose for photos, pretending to be rugged outdoorsmen, then turn around and eat a gourmet dinner at a table with white linens in the middle of the forest. It was the original glamping nightmare, proving that billionaires are physically incapable of being uncomfortable even for 5 minutes, treating the wilderness like it was just another branch of their factory that needed better management. 13. The beauty standards for 1920s flappers were brutal, but wealthy women took weight loss to a level of stupidity that makes modern diets look like genius science. Rumors and ads circulated among the elite about sanitized tapeworms sold in pills, creating a trend where rich ladies would voluntarily swallow a parasite to stay thin. The logic was that the worm would eat your lunch for you, allowing you to fit into that size 0 Chanel dress while slowly being eaten alive from the inside out. It is the kind of horror story that sounds fake, but desperate socialites were actually paying top dollar to host a monster in their intestines, proving that vanity is a much stronger force than common sense or basic survival instincts. 14. If you thought the lottery was a chaotic way to distribute money, meet Charles Vance Miller, a wealthy Canadian lawyer who decided to troll the entire world from beyond the grave with the Great Stork Derby. In his will, he promised to leave the bulk of his massive fortune to whichever Toronto woman could birth the most legal children in the 10 years following his death in 1926. He literally turned human reproduction into a spectator sport and a cash grab, causing a baby boom among families desperate for the prize. It was a rich man's final prank, forcing the government and courts to deal with a decade of chaos while he laughed from the afterlife, proving that some people will use their wealth to cause problems even when they are technically dead. 15. Boredom often leads to bad hobbies, but for the wealthy elites of the Jazz Age, it led to the obsession with spirit photography and seances that were obviously fake to everyone but them. Rich widows would pay massive sums to sit in dark rooms with mediums who would vomit up ectoplasm, which was usually just cheesecloth smeared with goose fat, and claim it was the spirit of a dead husband. It became a trendy parlor game to hold hands and watch a table levitate via hidden wires, while skepticism was checked at the door along with the fur coats. Even when Harry Houdini spent his time debunking these frauds and revealing the tricks, the rich just kept writing checks because, apparently, when you have everything money can buy in this world, you start trying to buy VIP access to the next one too. 16. The wealthy elite of the 1920s were allergic to actual physical effort, so they spent millions on the vibrating belt machine, which is exactly as stupid as it sounds. Instead of running or lifting weights like a normal human, a rich banker would strap a wide canvas belt around his waist that was attached to a loud, chugging motor. The machine would violently shake his butt for 20 minutes while he stood there completely motionless, usually smoking a cigar and reading the newspaper. They genuinely convinced themselves that if you jiggled your body hard enough, the fat would just give up and disappear without you ever breaking a sweat. It was the peak of delusion, a room full of tycoons shaking like bowls of jelly, believing they were becoming athletes when they were really just paying a machine to give them an aggressive hug. 17. If you have ever had a neighbor you hated, you probably just ignored them. But 1920s millionaires were petty on a whole different level and invented spite houses. These were actual structures built by rich people solely to annoy the person living next door. We are talking about spending a fortune to build a massive, ugly wall or a skinny, useless house right in front of a neighbor's window, just to block their view of the ocean or the street. One guy in Boston built a house that was only 10 feet wide just to cut off his brother's access to the road after a fight. It is the ultimate "I have too much money" power move, where you ruin your own property value and waste thousands of dollars just to make sure the guy next door lives in eternal shadow. 18. While most people were just trying to survive, the wealthy promoter C.C. Pyle decided that regular sports were too boring and created the Bunyan Derby, which was basically a torture chamber disguised as a foot race. He convinced hundreds of desperate men to run across the entire continent of America, from Los Angeles to New York, for a cash prize that most of them would never see. The wealthy spectators treated it like a traveling circus, cheering on runners whose feet were literally falling apart and who were hallucinating from exhaustion. Pyle followed along in a luxury bus, counting his money and treating these human beings like disposable toys. It was a brutal reality show before TV existed, proving that rich people would watch absolutely anything as long as someone else was doing the suffering. 19. We all love our pets, but the bored aristocracy of the Roaring Twenties took animal love to a psychotic level with elaborate pet funerals. While human beings were standing in bread lines, wealthy socialites were hosting funeral services for their dogs that cost more than a regular person's house. We are talking about velvet-lined caskets made of mahogany, massive floral arrangements, and a full hearse procession through the city streets for a poodle named Fifi. They would wear full black mourning clothes and cry over the grave, while the cemetery workers probably wondered why a dog had a better tombstone than their own grandparents. It is the kind of tone-deaf spending that makes you realize these people were living on a completely different planet where money had no meaning. 20. If looking out the window of a skyscraper was too boring, rich people would simply pay a human fly to climb the outside of the building with zero safety gear. This became a huge fad where a daredevil would scale the flat brick wall of a hotel just to entertain a crowd of wealthy folks sipping coffee on the balcony. It was the 1920s version of a superhero movie, but if the hero slipped, he would turn into a sidewalk pancake instantly. The wealthy patrons would place bets on whether the climber would make it to the top or fall to his doom, treating a man's life like a coin toss. It was pure adrenaline for the rich, fueled entirely by someone else risking their neck for a paycheck, because apparently the stock market wasn't a big enough gamble for them. 21. If you thought horse racing was exciting, the wealthy tourists in Florida decided that was too normal and started the absolute madness of ostrich racing. Rich people would head to specialized farms, hop into little sulky carts attached to giant, angry birds, and try to steer them around a track without getting pecked to death. An ostrich is basically a 6-foot-tall chicken with dinosaur legs and zero respect for human life. So watching a millionaire in a tuxedo trying to control one was pure comedy. The birds would frequently just stop running, sit down, or run into the fence, leaving the wealthy driver looking like a complete idiot, holding the reins to a giant feather duster. It was the kind of sport you invent when you have too much sunshine and not enough brain cells. 22. Prohibition was supposed to stop people from drinking, but the rich discovered the ultimate cheat code called medicinal whiskey. If you had enough money, you could find a doctor to diagnose you with some vague illness that required a pint of bourbon every single day to survive. Walgreens pharmacies expanded massively during this time because sick millionaires were lining up to get their prescription booze for ailments like nervousness or chilliness. Even Winston Churchill got a doctor's note saying he needed alcohol with every meal for his health when he visited New York. It was the only time in history where being a wealthy alcoholic was technically considered a medical treatment plan, and the waiting rooms were just parties without music. 23. The obsession with weight loss led wealthy women to buy La Mar-reducing soap, a product that promised to wash the fat right off your body while you stood in the shower. The ads claimed that this magical soap would melt away double chins and ankle fat just by scrubbing, which is scientifically impossible unless the soap was made of acid. But logic did not stop the rich from spending a fortune on these bars, standing in their marble bathrooms scrubbing themselves raw, hoping to look like a flapper. It is hilarious to think of the upper class believing that fat was just some kind of dirt you could rinse down the drain if you bought the expensive brand of suds. 24. You can't talk about 1920s money without the man who invented the art of ripping it off, Charles Ponzi. It wasn't just average Joes. Wealthy investors threw cash at him because he promised 50% profit in 45 days using international postage coupons. He bought zero coupons. He just paid the old rich guys with the new rich guys' money. It was so stupidly simple, yet the smartest tycoons in Boston emptied their bank accounts for him. It proves that greed is a powerful blinder. And if someone offers you a magical return on investment involving the postal service, maybe keep your wallet closed. 25. We think of crossword puzzles as a quiet hobby for Sunday mornings, but in the 1920s, it became a manic obsession that sent rich people to the hospital. The crossword craze was so intense that wealthy socialites hosted puzzle parties where everyone dressed in black and white checkered clothes to look like a grid. But the funniest part was that doctors started reporting cases of crossword insomnia and crossword eye strain because these people refused to sleep until they finished the puzzle. They treated a word game like it was a life-or-death situation, ignoring their families and businesses just to figure out a 4-letter word for an Egyptian sun god. 26. You know a trend is stupid when people start redecorating their entire lives around a board game, but that is exactly what happened with the mahjong craze of 1923. Wealthy socialites did not just play the game, they treated it like a religious cult, spending the equivalent of thousands of dollars on tiles made of real ivory and gold. But the boredom went deeper. They would actually hire tutors to teach them strategy, and throw parties where everyone had to dress in expensive silk robes and speak in fake, broken accents. It was cultural appropriation fueled by extreme wealth and boredom, where grown adults sat around a table for 12 hours a day clacking tiles together because they literally had nothing better to do with their time. 27. Prohibition made buying alcohol annoying, so some bored rich folks decided to bypass the bootlegger and just sniff industrial chemicals at ether parties. Yes, instead of a martini, guests would hold a rag soaked in liquid ether to their faces, which would make them giggle, drool, and eventually pass out on the Persian rug. The best part is that ether is highly flammable, so if someone decided to light a cigar to look cool, they risked blowing their own face off along with the host's mansion. It is the ultimate proof that if you take away a rich person's champagne, they will happily inhale dangerous medical solvents just to feel a little bit dizzy on a Friday night. 28. Vanity in the 1920s was a contact sport, and wealthy people with crooked noses bought a torture device called the Trados Nose Shaper. This was a metal harness that strapped to your face with screws and leather belts, which you were supposed to wear all night while you slept. The ads claimed it would mold your nose into a perfect shape, but in reality, you just looked like Hannibal Lecter's grandfather trying to get a good night's rest. Rich people paid good money to voluntarily clamp their faces into a metal vise for 8 hours a night, convinced that if they just suffered enough, they would wake up looking like a movie star instead of a person with a bruised face. 29. American millionaires in the 1920s had everything except class, so they started the embarrassing trend of buying fake European titles. Bored heiresses and tycoons paid bankrupt European royals massive sums of money just to be called duke or princess at dinner parties in Chicago. It was a purely transactional ego boost where a cattle rancher's daughter would marry a destitute Italian count solely for the crest on the stationery. The newspapers mocked them relentlessly, but the wealthy didn't care. They were happy to trade their hard-earned dollars for a dusty title, proving that the American dream was actually just a desperate need to sound like a character from a medieval fantasy novel. 30. President Calvin Coolidge and his wealthy peers were too busy to ride real animals, so they installed the electric mechanical horse in their dressing rooms. This was a heavy, motorized contraption made of wood and leather that plugged into the wall and violently bucked back and forth to simulate riding a trot. Grown, powerful men would put on their pajamas, climb onto this robotic beast, and get shaken around for 30 minutes before dinner, claiming it was vigorous exercise. It looks absolutely ridiculous. A millionaire holding onto leather reins in his bedroom, riding a wooden toy that goes nowhere, just to say he got a workout in without having to smell an actual horse. 31. Buying shoes is usually a mundane chore, but the wealthy elite of the 1920s turned it into a radioactive science experiment with the shoe-fitting fluoroscope. Rich mothers would drag their children into high-end department stores and stick their feet into a wooden box that blasted them with live X-rays, just to see if their toes had enough room in a new pair of loafers. They would stare into the viewing scope, fascinated by the green glowing bones of their own feet, treating dangerous radiation like a fun carnival attraction. It is mind-blowing that they thought exposing their DNA to high-voltage X-rays was a smart way to buy leather sandals, but apparently getting cancer was a small price to pay for a shoe that didn't pinch. 32. The ego of 1920s billionaires was so fragile that Walter Chrysler and his banking rival decided to turn the New York skyline into a petty measuring contest. While building the Chrysler Building, Walter wanted the title of world's tallest building, but his rival was building a taller bank down the street. So, out of pure spite and boredom, Chrysler secretly built a massive 185-foot steel spike hidden inside the fire shaft of his building. At the very last second, he popped it out of the roof like a giant metal jack-in-the-box, just to scream, "I win," at his neighbor. It was a multi-million-dollar architectural prank solely because one rich guy couldn't handle being second best in a vertical size comparison. 33. Since carrying a flask was too obvious for the distinguished gentleman, the bored wealthy invented gadget canes to hide their alcoholism in plain sight. We are talking about walking sticks that were actually hollow tubes filled with gin or whiskey, complete with a tiny hidden glass in the handle. A rich guy could be standing in the middle of a church or a board meeting, unscrew the top of his cane, and take a shot while pretending to lean on it for support. It was basically James Bond technology but used exclusively for getting drunk at 10 a.m. on a Tuesday. They spent a fortune on custom engineering just to avoid being sober for more than 20 minutes at a time. 34. You think modern self-help gurus are annoying? In the 1920s, the wealthy fell for quaism, a lazy mental trend started by a French pharmacist named Émile Coué. The entire cure consisted of tying a string with 20 knots and repeating the phrase, "Every day, in every way, I am getting better and better," over and over again like a broken record. Rich socialites hosted parties where they sat in circles, chanting this to themselves, convinced that muttering a magical sentence would cure their liver failure or baldness. It was the ultimate rich person solution. No exercise, no medicine, just talking to yourself in a mirror until you deluded yourself into thinking you were fixed. 35. Fashion in the Jazz Age was often questionable, but the raccoon coat craze was a special kind of stupid adopted by wealthy college kids and their dads. We are not talking about a subtle fur trim. These were massive floor-length coats made from the entire skins of heavy raccoons, making the wearer look like a bipedal bear. They were heavy, smelled terrible when wet, and were completely impractical for driving the tiny convertibles popular at the time. Yet, every rich guy had to have one to look cool at football games, sweating profusely under 30 pounds of dead animal fur just to signal to everyone else that he could afford to look like a roadkill Sasquatch. 36. You might think miniature golf is for children's birthday parties, but in the late 1920s, it was the fortnight of the wealthy elite. Known as the Madness of 1930, which started bubbling in the late 20s, rich people obsessed over Tom Thumb golf courses so much that they built them on top of New York skyscrapers. We are talking about men in tuxedos and women in diamond necklaces putting golf balls through tiny windmills on the roof of the Waldorf Astoria, while the city below them was falling apart. It became such a mania that they had rooftop golf tees, proving that if you give a rich person a stick and a ball, they will find a way to make it exclusive, expensive, and completely impractical by putting it 50 stories in the air. 37. If you had money in the 1920s, you didn't just buy a house, you bought a city that didn't exist. The Florida land boom was a mass hallucination where wealthy northerners bought oceanfront lots sight unseen, only to arrive and find their property was a mosquito-infested swamp 10 miles from the water. Promoters sold land using maps where they literally drew in fake roads and hotels. It was the ultimate FOMO moment, where tycoons exchanged real cash for alligator farms because a glossy brochure told them it was the next Venice. When the bubble burst, millions of dollars evaporated into the mud, proving that being rich doesn't mean you can read a map. 38. Prohibition was a nuisance, so the bored wealthy invented the cruise to nowhere, which is exactly what it sounds like. They would charter massive luxury liners to sail exactly 3 miles off the coast of New York, just past the jurisdiction of U.S. law, drop the anchor, and drink illegal booze until they passed out. The ship didn't go to Europe or the Caribbean. It just sat in the middle of the ocean in a circle while a jazz band played and millionaires vomited over the railing. It was the most expensive bar tab in history, fueled by people who were so desperate for a martini that they were willing to float on a boat that wasn't going anywhere just to spite the government. Or through 39. If you thought modern plastic surgery was risky, wealthy women in the 1920s were voluntarily getting paraffin injections to smooth out their skin. They would pay shady doctors to inject hot, liquid wax directly under the skin of their faces to fill in wrinkles. It looked great for about a week, until the wax started to harden and form permanent, painful lumps that could not be removed. These women effectively turned their faces into candles, sacrificing their long-term looks because they were terrified of a single laugh line. It was a beauty treatment that backfired immediately, all funded by unlimited bank accounts and zero medical common sense. 40. Wrinkles are the enemy of the rich, so naturally, they turn to the terrifying rubber beauty mask to fight gravity. These were full-face rubber hoods that looked like something a bank robber or a serial killer would wear. but they were sold as high-end beauty treatments. The idea was to wear this sweaty, airtight rubber gimp mask all night to perspire the toxins out of your skin. Imagine waking up next to your wealthy wife and she looks like a melted tire because she thinks sweating into a rubber bag is the secret to eternal youth. It was uncomfortable, smelled like a tire factory, and terrified the servants, but it was all the rage in the boudoir. 41. The wealthy got bored of watching planes fly straight, so they fueled the barnstorming craze by paying pilots to do incredibly stupid things for money. Rich patrons would hire stunt pilots to fly biplanes right through their own barns or under tiny bridges while they watched from a safe distance holding a cocktail. It was a chaotic mix of ego and adrenaline where millionaires treated airplanes like toys, betting on whether the pilot would crash into a tree or actually pull off the loop-the-loop. They essentially crowdfunded a demolition derby in the sky because watching a plane land safely on a runway was just too boring for a Sunday afternoon. 42. Hair removal is a pain, but in the 1920s, wealthy women skipped the razor and went straight for Kremlu, a luxury cream that was literally made of rat poison. The active ingredient was thallium, a toxic metal used to kill rodents, but it was marketed as a safe way to remove upper lip hair. Rich ladies slathered this poison on their faces for months, celebrating their smooth skin right up until their teeth started falling out, and they went blind from heavy metal poisoning. It is the ultimate example of dangerous marketing, where the most expensive cream on the shelf was actually a slow-acting assassination attempt disguised as a beauty product. 43. If you were a wealthy writer or thinker who couldn't focus because the world was too loud, you bought the Isolator, a bizarre helmet invented in 1925. It looked like a deep-sea diving helmet made of wood and felt that completely covered your head, blocking all sound and vision except for a tiny slit for your eyes. It even had an oxygen tank attached so you wouldn't suffocate in your own focus bubble. Rich intellectuals would sit in their studies wearing this claustrophobic wooden bucket, looking like an alien invader, just to write a few pages of a novel without hearing a bird chirp. It proves that money can buy you silence, but it makes you look like a rejected character from a sci-fi comic book. 44. Finally, the ultimate proof of wealthy boredom and stupidity was their reliance on Evangeline Adams, the stock market astrologer. In the late 1920s, some of the most powerful bankers on Wall Street were not making decisions based on economics. They were paying Adams thousands of dollars to read their horoscopes. She would look at the position of Jupiter and tell them to buy or sell, and they actually listened. The entire US economy was being partially steered by a woman reading star charts for bored millionaires who were too lazy to read a financial report. It explains a lot about the 1929 crash, when you realize the guys in charge were betting millions on whether Mercury was in retrograde. After all this, don't pretend this was just old history. People with too much money still do insane things. We just call it lifestyle now. So here's the real question. What bored rich behavior from history did we not include that should have made this list? If you know one, drop it. If you don't, like the video anyway, subscribe, and admit this was more disturbing than you expected.